Hi, everyone. Pleasure to welcome you all here for the next LinkedIn Live. Expect the unexpected. Today, I'm joined with Jordan Levine, who is a lecturer at MIT and a partner at Dynamic Ideas. And we're going to talk about AI and bias and some of the things that we need to be conscious of with respect to building models, using models, and being really critical about the data that we're using and the outcomes that come out of these models. Jordan, thank you for joining me today.
Thanks for having me, Scott.
So Jordan, one of the things I wanted to start off with is essentially a conversation around what are the preconceived notions of AI bias? Very often we think of AI as the villain here, and we talk about bias. But do you have any examples that you want to go into that are illustrative of how AI, is biased or can be biased from your practice?
Yeah, thanks, Scott. As a general theme, I always like to try to simplify lexicon and language as great as possible. And this is across the field of analytics in terms of both data, use of math, computer science. So bias and ethics are fairly high level terms. And so what I like to do is always get very granular and identify issues, define them, articulate them, and then search for tools to make them better. So as an example, one type of bias that I'm aware of is called representation bias. And its definition is that models can make more mistakes for underrepresented groups. And as examples, let's start with credit risk scoring. If you have a broad population and you have certain demographic groups that are smaller in terms of sample size, a generalized algorithm could treat those groups unfairly or give them a different outcome. So then, representation bias, models make more mistakes for underrepresented groups. So then what do you do? What tools exist in credit risk scoring? I love your blog. I read it often, and you've put forth that monotonicity. In other words, almost data pre-processing before you hit the algorithm. Set a standard that any variable that goes into the algorithm has to be moving in one direction or the other relative to the outcome variable. Highly logical to me. In other settings, and so that's a tool, right? For credit risk scoring, monotonicity is a tool to overcome representation bias. In other settings, we can't rely on monotonicity. So in healthcare, for example, our bodies react and respond in quite varying manners, and you get, I don't want to say bizarre, but you can get complex interactions between variables. And so a tool to solve this is the idea of cohort studies. And cohort studies were first designed in the 1950s and 1960s in response to the Framingham Heart Study. The designers of that experiment, and the Framingham Heart Study is quite impactful. It's 50, 60, 70 years old. However, every time you and I go to the physician's office, they check our blood pressure, check our cholesterol. So it still has impact today. The study designers in the 1960s realized that different cohorts reacted differently or had different results, and thus they didn't demand monotonicity, which you can do in the credit risk scoring world, and I think is wonderful. Rather, they said, look, let's do cohort analysis and see how our model reacts to different demographics. And if we have to redo a whole new experiment, let's do that. So you asked me about bias and in artificial intelligence and machine learning. My answer is get really crisp on specific issues, and I just covered representation bias. Define it. Models can make more mistakes for underrepresented groups, and then think about tools that exist to address it. And to me, that is the way forward, to take a very complex and high-level discussion of bias and make it quite granular and actionable.
No, I really like that. And, I think that's one of the things that we forget sometimes. And I think it's getting worse, right, with a lot of the open source and easy availability to sometimes data, is that we're not asking critical questions, right? So for example, monotonicity is a requirement of being palatable in the credit risk space. But what are the outcomes of the models? What do we have to watch out for? And then constrain the model development or constrain the data in such ways that we make sure that it's representative of the classes that we care about. I think that's important. And I think what you're saying is absolutely correct, is we need to really not just take the data at face value, right? We need to understand how we've collected that data, what sort of biases may be in there. And then, in some sense, you're right. It comes down to, in many ways, I guess, success criteria, right? What is a successful model? Very often we think about prediction, but a successful model can be measured in lots of other ways, right? For example, the explainability, the interpretability, or palatability, right? Or specific performance on types of classes of customers that you want to ensure that the model is reactive to, and if you think that it's not, right, that you collect additional data or you design the model differently. So this comes to this sort of second topic, which is garbage in, garbage out, right? We talk about that from a data science perspective all the time, right? And we say, well, if we feed a model bad data, then you're going to get a bad model, and therefore we have this sort of conversation that AI may not be inherently good or bad, right? It is simply a representation of what's fed to it, and we have to be very careful. The same way we have to be careful, back to the other comment about the heart study, we have to be careful what we eat potentially, and how we conduct our lives. We have to be careful how we feed our AI models. So how prevalent do you think that is today, that people are really thinking, maybe two topics, right? One is, actively thinking about how they're feeding, right, and doing the care and feeding of these AI models. And is it, in everyone's purview, right, how important this is?
Yeah, so I think garbage in, garbage out is persistent in today's world. I think it was persistent a decade ago, and I think we'll have the same issue manifest itself over the next decade. I would assert that it's quite addressable. And that we all have the technical tools to address it. The gap is an understanding between what I'll call business teams and analytics teams. Mm-hmm. So what I mean by that is, if I have a data set, and let's say I'm going to take 30 variables to predict credit risk score. Those 30 variables, and let's say there are 100,000 records across, and then 30 variables, and we're going to then make a prediction. In today's technical world, it's not impossible to render scatter plots or box plots by variable. It's almost a line of code, right? A data science or a technical team can rapidly generate hundreds of univariate plots. That's easy. We have the technology, we have the display capability, we have the ability. It's quite automated. This is novel to me because I didn't know how to use R or Python, let's say 7 years ago, and I would just render these plots in PowerPoint as a consultant, and it was quite time consuming, right? But like now I understand that with ggplot or matplotlib, a number of open source tools, I can render the plot. So from a technical capability, that the world exists in that you can generate univariate plots before going to the model phase, right? You can demonstrate significant descriptive analytics. I think where the gap is, it's then where the business team needs to get their eyes on these plots and go in with a red pen and say, that's not logical. I don't understand that. That makes intuitive sense. That is consistent with my 15 years in credit risk, in writing insurance underwriting, in extending loans in the banking environment. So back to another healthcare example, anytime I do a predictive algorithm with a physician, I kind of force march them, and excuse the Marine Corps expression, but I force march them through 50 plots. And I say, look, does this make sense? And the learning and the education that I get when they're like, this doesn't make sense. And I'm like, great, then we can talk about it. And that is how you prevent garbage in, garbage out. It's feasible. I think the gap is that technical teams sometimes lack the conviction to tell the managerial or the business team, like, we have to do this. Mm-hmm. And the business team doesn't realize they can just say, get me these 100 plots because I want to review them with a red pen. I don't think they're aware how easy it is to generate those type of plots.
No, I think that's a great point. And I love the force march, right? I mean, I think that's really important, right? The previous topic, we talked about design, right? Monotonicity and, upfront knowing what the mission is essentially, right? And how we're going to get there and how we're going to define success and how we're going to define failure. I think the other aspect which you're bringing up is really important is that in many ways, there's no excuse for not spending the time other than maybe forcing that march and having that conversation on the business side. Because it's so important, right? And so the tools exist and the ability exists, and And one of the things I've been talking about for quite some time, and I think it's really important, is that there has to be a corporate standard of how we're going to, define models, develop models, adhere to, development standards. At the same point, there has to be, this concept of acceptance by the business, and part of it might be, we design the model and develop the model appropriately, but the other one would be just what you discussed, right? Let's make sure that we go through this. And some organizations deal with that with ethics teams, right? And they'll have, teams that will look at that. But, this intersection with the business is not kind of emphasized enough, right? And I think it's super important. And frankly, right, one of the things that I think about a lot is why don't models come with hazard lights, right? And in some sense, right, there may not be an automated hazard light with every score you get and every model that gets developed, but going through this sort of exhaustive maybe set of analyses to make sure that the business would sign off and say it's palatable, it's reasonable, is super important, because there's no way that data scientists necessarily will have all that knowledge in their head. Good. So then, let's talk about the data scientist, right? For a long time was the sexiest job, right? It might still be the sexiest job, but it's a tough job, right? And so, I guess the question is, where does this lie, right? So you just brought up a great point, right? So go on a forced march and make sure that the business has looked at this, right? We're not going to allow, let's say, the business to be complacent with the data scientist saying it works, right? And the data scientist, shouldn't be able to get away with building a model without really thinking about these. But is it fair, or is it correct that the data scientist does this alone? And maybe you could expand a little bit around where does that responsibility lie, or what are some of the best models to ensure that they get that interlock?
Yeah. So I believe that modeling efforts should support decision-making, which drives value. And thus, accountability to me lies with whoever the decision maker is. And in the corporate setting, that's often the P&L leader, the profit and loss lead. That's the business unit president. That's the person in charge for budgetary decision-making. And in the current world we live in right now, we don't have, I think of your State of Responsible AI report that FICO sponsored along with Corinium. And I think about the data point that 43% of respondents said they have no responsibility beyond regulatory compliance to ethically manage AI. I think about that, okay? And that might be the case, and your wonderful survey participants who gave you that honest perspective, that's logical, right? We're business people. We live in a world governed by laws, and we follow the laws, and otherwise we compete. But that's not the way the media sees the world, right or wrong. And I mean, I can't open my newsfeed without seeing a ethics or AI or bias issue reported. And thus, to the 43% of respondents who don't feel they need to go above and beyond current regulatory affairs, I would say that the media disagrees. And thus, if they're looking for how to think through this, start with decisions that are made. So in financial services and in the credit risk world, how do you extend credit cards? How do you extend loans? How do you extend mortgages? How do you extend insurance? Think about those decisions, and then identify where models are used. And whoever is the P&L owner of those product lines, to me, has accountability.
Yep. Yeah, I agreed. Right. And I think this is one of the things that I think is really important is driving that conversation, because you're right. The consumer's not going to care. They're going to have an expectation, right? Or those that are being kind of judged by the model. And increasingly, right, AI and machine learning are used in ways that we don't really fully understand as just human citizens that move around the world. And so, I would agree with you. I think, there's an accountability, regardless of whether or not there's regulation that defines that responsibility. And, I think one of the things that we often talk about is that this is a board level responsibility, to your point, right? It could be the P&L level, but at the very level of, let's say, a board, right? The board needs to feel comfortable that there's a responsible AI direction being employed within an organization. And, for me, a lot of times that translates into a codified sort of code of standards around model development. And, it would imply and it would dictate essentially how that's done uniformly, right? And, I like cars. I'm a car guy, and I sometimes think about this. When I bring my car in to get the tires changed, let's say, it's not, and then I get in an accident because my brakes didn't work. It's not really reasonable to pin that on the person that's changed my tires. Maybe they'll observe that the brakes are not in great shape when they take off the tires, but that's not what they're there for, right? And so we need to define very succinctly, what are the roles and responsibilities of the business owners, of the data scientists, and so that there's no confusion. And worse yet, right? Maybe we have a data scientist who's exceptional, right? And she's really focused on ethics and those items. And we have another one that is disinterested, right? Or uneducated. And businesses just can't operate in that way, right? And so I think this is part of our transformation. But it really, I think, to your point, goes to those business leaders that have to stand up at the end of the day and say, this is an ethical use of model. It's been built properly, and this is the code that we use to develop it. And it involves not only data scientists, but to your point, a really good point, the business owners and how they're going to agree to that it is developed properly and met the success criteria that we'd start off with one of these models and have that codified, right? And very often I talk about this being on blockchain as one of my favorite technologies because then there's no take backsies, right? You essentially committed to the blockchain. We all make mistakes, but having that codified and ensure that that's understood, I think, is super important. That drives accountability, which is a really big part of ethics. So, maybe just getting to some brass tacks, right? We talked a little bit about palatability and monotonicity and monitoring, and if some of the viewers that were listening in right now are basically saying, listen, I have to start this journey, right? I'm not feeling very comfortable that I'm in the wrong side of that percentage with respect to whether my organization knows how to explain models or knows that we are following ethical practices from ethical AI perspective or responsible AI perspective. What would be some of the starting points? I have a few ideas there, but what's your thoughts about these concepts of palatability and monitoring and monotonicity, and maybe others that you've run across in your practice?
Yep. So to me, monotonicity, palatability, and observing are tools. But my first step is we discussed is business accepts accountability, or the healthcare organization accepts accountability that any decision that leverages a model is owned by the business or the organizational leaders. The next step then is what biases exist that we know of in terms of the conceptual definition of them. And I have 4 on my list: correlation bias, representation bias, measurement bias, disenfranchisement bias. So these are my big 4. I know there are more, and I'm constantly looking for them. But once accountability is accepted, you have a list of these 4 biases, and then it comes to then apply various tools, which your blog has a excellent set for dealing with credit risk score black box models. I have a couple of interpretable methods that I like as well that I often use. And so the key is accountability, define the types of biases that exist, and then look around for the tools that are emerging in the market to resolve them. And to me, that's a great first step.
Yeah, I think that's spot on. And things that come to my mind in this area are, number one is probably to really, to really focus on and being very critical, right? That around data, right? And I think we kind of know this, in terms of all the fake news or claims of fake news, and when we look at data, looking at data and saying, is this data actually, representative, right? And that just asking that question can demonstrate, could prevent a huge amount of problems, right? When we look at gender bias and ethnic-based bias, right? Or even simpler sort of biases with respect to parts of the United States where the model is more applicable than less applicable based on the people that live there and their socioeconomic states. And so one is just asking those questions. The other one, I think, is one that I think is really important, and it's one that we don't talk a lot about, which is, we have to be, as data scientists, even critical about, let's say, the tags, right? Who was a credit risk? Who's a fraud, let's say? And who's making that judgment? Well, at the end of the day, human beings are making that judgment, right? So if the people that are tagging the data, right, assigning the goods and the bads or the outcome are inherently sort of biased in their use of the model, or the model's reflecting a biased sort of ecosystem, right? Because the model itself is just a tool, right? It's not all knowing. It's just kind of making things more efficient and superhuman. But then really taking a look at, what is that outcome data, and whether or not we think that is, reasonable or not. And I often have conversations with clients where I have to explain the difference between a fraud tag and a credit risk tag, and that's a very different assertion, right? If you default on a loan, right, and I think it's because you are a fraudster versus someone that has a credit risk challenge, right? There's a very different way we have that conversation, right? And there's a different set of circumstances and outcomes for you as a consumer, right? And so, really looking at where bias is coming through the human channel, how that intimately at step zero impacts the model, I think is important. I know that's something that you've also observed, right? In terms of this sort of human-induced bias in terms of the decision making.
Yeah, and I classify that as measurement bias, and I define it as convenient proxies used as dependent variables that end up being biased against certain groups. Yeah. And so what I mean by that is in the credit risk world, what you just described is a human putting a label in place. And if that human has certain biases intrinsic to them, the labels they put in place are going to carry those biases. Yeah. So I think I have one interesting case. Mississippi Flowers versus Mississippi is a Supreme Court case from a couple of years ago, and a Mississippi DA was striking jurors in a certain way. And via analysis, we were able to show this pretty cleanly and clearly. And the way we do it is we take all of our input variables. And so the way a DA will justify strike, they'll look at the juror, they'll look at the juror's history, they'll have voir dire data in their interviews. And if you then build a tree-based algorithm without certain demographics, without race, without gender, you'll then have an algorithm that says the likelihood that the juror will be struck or not. Mm-hmm. The modeler can then, because we didn't have, say, race included, the modeler then can feed in different demographics, different race, Caucasian versus African American. And if each cohort or output or prediction is fundamentally different, it lends a pretty solid case that there is bias in action. And thus, back to the framework of like 1, accept accountability, 2, define the bias, 3, what tools exist. You described measurement bias in the credit risk scores. The way I think about it as a human putting the dependent variable in, fraud versus credit risk. And then a tool that I know exists is build a interpretable tree-based model without the certain variable of interest, and then feed in the subsets to look for deviance or variation in outcomes. Yeah, no, agreed, right? And I think maybe that's one piece that we can leave people with, right? Is it from a tactic is focusing the business on interrogating, let's say, the data that we get, right? If we have like 20% of our, let's say, analysts that are misinformed or maybe explicitly or implicitly biased in their outcomes, right? A relatively simple model can ferret that out, right? And that's a conversation, right? And maybe what that conversation is education, so that people can curb their behaviors, right? Maybe it's just awareness, so that they're aware of unconscious bias that they're using in the decision making. And I think that is really, really important, because that's the business side, right? I mean, once it gets to the data scientists, they may not be, always have an ability to make those judgments. The case you talked about, it was pretty blatant, right? So I think that one is one that is easy, but I think, maybe just starting that conversation is really important. And I think education is critical here. And what I mean by that, I don't mean on the machine learning side or the analytics side. A quick anecdote from my past. I was at a company and they used to have me do a fair amount of interviews, and I had guidelines to turn down or pass the candidate, as in like turn down or send them to the next round. Yep. And their recruiters told me I was fairly harsh. And I said, look, I'm following the protocol. I'm doing what you told me. Yep. Therefore, I'm not harsh. This was my perspective. Yep. 2 years later, they come back and they're like, listen, this is you benchmarked against 20 of your peers. And it turns out you are actually a tough grader. And once I saw that data, mm-hmm. my behavior changed overnight. And I became a more lenient grader. So, in the spirit of, is there mislabeling going on? Is there bias? To me, get the right fact base in place and then show it to the workforce making decisions. And that to me that's analytics to the rescue. That's not bias is the enemy and we need to ferret it out. It's, here are standards, here are the protocols, and then here's a fair and honest perspective on whether an employee is in adherence. And if they're not, a simple fact base can help them steer behavior.
Absolutely. No, I love it, right? Because, we all need to make progress on what is societal bias, right? Oftentimes we throw up our hands and we say, well, the model is just a representation of a biased society, right? And part of that is changing the way we all view it. So I think measurement's important. And I'll give a Yogi Berra quote. It ain't over till it's over, and that's that applies to bias, right? It applies when we build models and we have to monitor those models for continual sort of bias and whether that's changing or not. And I would hope, right, for those that are monitoring bias, right, the models they build don't show bias. But to your point, right, as we start to really focus on where bias creeps in, and very often it's going to creep in from how we select data. And some of it's going to be on how we tag data, and we help people with where they are with respect to their peers. We make forward progress, and that'd be part of the monitoring. Jordan, I think we're at the end of our time. I really want to thank you for this conversation. I think it's been pretty interesting indeed, and I think it really talks to the interplay of both data science and model building and the business, right? And maybe even we've touched on a few topics around how we see maybe years from now that we start to make forward progress on some of the societal biases, because it's not just the AI, right? It's the entire ecosystem we live in, and measurement and honesty and metrics around that will be how we improve. So thank you so much. I do appreciate your time with that, Jordan.
Thank you, Scott.
So next time I'm going to do the next LinkedIn Live will be on the Expect the Unexpected. I'll be joined by Ethan Dornholm from FICO. We're going to talk about model governance, and Jordan, we'll probably focus on within FICO what we do to put the controls in place, and what we do to define up front what does it mean to be successful. And successful is multivariate in terms of its success criteria. So hopefully everyone can join us for that in the coming weeks. Jordan, thank you again. Really appreciate all your insight and your time today. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.